As Homeland Security weighs whether to reduce deportations of immigrants living in the U.S. illegally, there's a new book out delving into this country's immigration history. In his book, Calling the Masses, UC San Diego sociology professor David Fitzgerald explores the relationship between democracy and racist immigration policies in the Western Hemisphere. He joins me now. There is a widespread view that in the long run, ultimately, democracy and racism can't coexist. What did your research find?
You know, that's an idea that I had and that I ascribed to as a political ideal, but what our research actually shows, that if you look at the relationship between democracy and racism in practice, is that the most racist immigration policy over the last 200 years was actually in the United States, which is the most democratic country consistently in the Western Hemisphere. And you see other democracies being early to put in racist restrictions and also much later than some undemocratic countries to take them away.
Give me some examples of these racist immigration policies in the U.S.
So in the U.S., from the get-go, from the founding of the Republic in 1790, the first naturalization law restricted naturalization to whites. And beginning in 1803, it restricted the immigration of blacks. Beginning in 1862, it restricted the immigration of Chinese. And then later, many other groups added. Basically, all non-Northwestern European whites were at some point excluded, or they had their numbers deliberately reduced.
So the reasons offered in your book for these restrictive policies towards Asians, towards Africans, was that these people were incapable of self-government. What was the evidence for this belief?
There really wasn't any evidence for that, but almost every group that is in America today is descended from a group that at one point was considered to be incapable of self-government. So whether it was Irish Catholics or Mexicans or Chinese or Indians or blacks, all of these groups were thought to be incapable of self-government. And it was simply a self-serving way, I think, for the white elite at that time, as well as the white populace, to maintain their privileges.
And give me some examples of undemocratic societies that didn't have these immigration policies, these restrictive ones.
Well, at some point, every single country in the Western Hemisphere did have policies that explicitly restricted based on race. The difference is that the U.S. had the longest run and was also late to take those policies away. But there certainly were countries which were undemocratic, like Chile and Cuba, Argentina and Mexico in the late 1930s and early 1940s that took away those restrictions a full generation before they were taken away in the U.S. and Canada.
And what prompted change? What prompted immigration reform in this country?
The big change was foreign policy. As the U.S. became more and more engaged in Latin America and around the world in World War II and the Cold War, it found that when it restricted people from coming based on their race, that was humiliating to the people in those countries and their governments as they decolonized. And it became increasingly difficult for the U.S. to try to vie for the hearts and minds of the world's population, while at the same time saying that more than half of them were racially inferior. So it was really for foreign policy reasons coming out of the White House and the State Department that those explicit racial restrictions were taken away in 1965.
What about today's immigration policies? Do you see any racist remnants?
We do. There has been a major change, and the current policy doesn't explicitly restrict by race in a way that it has for most of U.S. history, but there are vestiges of those policies that were deliberately put into place to lower the numbers who would otherwise come of particular groups. So for example, if you look at family preference visas in the current U.S. immigration system, that are about 1 out of 5 immigration visas, it's much harder for people from countries with large populations in practice to come legally than for people from countries with smaller populations or less demand to come to the U.S. So it means in practice that for Mexicans and Filipinos, they're typically waiting twice as long as nationals of other countries to get into the U.S., up to 23 years.
And very quickly, what made you decide to write this book?
I decided to write this book because I had seen a lot of case studies of the way these policies worked in different countries, but my co-author and I had never seen a single volume that looked at the entire expanse of the New World over more than 200 years to understand how these policies worked everywhere.
And we've got to wrap it there. David Fitzgerald, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks very much.